Hi, everybody, and welcome back to Let's ComBinate Drugs and Devices. I'm your host, Subi Sadeh, and I've been working in industry now for more than 10 years. I've worked in quality, I've worked in research and development, and I've worked in manufacturing operations. And I've been getting a bunch of questions from students who are trying to break into industry, asking what do the different roles actually mean? What does that mean day to day? And so I remember that I recorded a video about this months ago that I never actually posted. So I found it. I go into the 8 basic role categories that most people can break into with a BS in bioengineering, biomedical engineering, or a life science related field. And this kind of spans through medical devices, pharma, diagnostics, or really any life science related field. So if you enjoyed this episode, please do like, subscribe, and share. It helps grow the channel, and I hope you enjoy this one. I wanted to break down what people actually do in companies. In other words, the different functional roles that are in industry, because you'll hear a lot of job titles thrown around like quality engineer or regulatory specialist or validation engineer or research associate. And it gets really confused, especially when you add in the layer of medical devices or pharma or biotech. And if it's a clinical situation or a commercial situation, I wanted to focus on some of the major functions in life sciences, and we're going to cover 8 in total. These kind of span, broadly speaking, pharma, biotech, medtech, and the IVD space. And these 8 functional areas are present at most companies, whether they're big and small. So understanding what these different functions are responsible for, how they fit together, is a really critical step towards understanding the industry that you're going to be working in and the different jobs that you're going to be applying for. So the 8 that I wanted to cover: quality assurance, regulatory affairs, research and development, R&D, clinical affairs, manufacturing/operations, QC/analytical testing, supply chain procurement, and validation and technical services. As far as the actual titles go, we'll keep titles flexible. I may go through a couple of different titles that you may see because titles change across different companies. So the goal here is to understand the different types of work and not specifically to memorize role names because they'll be different across the board. The first role, you got to start with where you love: quality assurance. I'm a quality person. I've been in quality now for 8 or 9 years, maybe, of my career. And I can't really see myself getting out of quality unless it's like for a short stint to gain some skill sets and come back. But quality assurance, as far as I know, is the only role that is required by law. So if you look at some of the regulations, they require you to have a quality unit, and the quality unit needs to be standalone because it's supposed to be keeping the rest of the company in check from a quality point of view. We're not going to delve into all of those details. You can look at some of my podcasts if you're interested in that, or research it on your own, the definitions and responsibilities of a quality unit. But the quality assurance role is responsible for maintaining and enforcing the quality system. So the typical responsibilities for quality includes things like reviewing and approving batch records, reviewing and approving deviations, investigations, nonconformances, CAPAs, reviewing and approving SOPs, sometimes owning SOPs, sometimes owning CAPAs. They're responsible for releasing product for distribution, in other words, batch release. They're responsible for managing change control and doc control systems. What that means is they're not specifically maybe handling every single change that's going through, but the process and system by which you're handling changes is typically owned by quality assurance, as is the system by which you're handling documentation. They're responsible for coordinating internal audits and supporting regulatory inspections. So typically the quality head is the person who would receive, let's say, FDA or a health authority if they're visiting your site for an inspection. They're also responsible for overseeing the training program and tracking compliance of people's training. They're responsible for qualifying suppliers and monitoring suppliers. They're responsible for ensuring data integrity ensuring that there's traceability and that there's compliance across organizations. One of my mentors told me before that in quality, you're either a toll booth or you're a lane line. And that ultimately, depending on the stage of the product or the situation that you're in, you might need to be one, the other, or both. But QA is really a gatekeeper. They do own a bunch of elements and systems, but they're typically not the ones who are responsible for running experiments, let's say, or manufacturing products. But they make sure that experiments are run correctly, and they make sure that products are manufactured in accordance with their requirements. Your job is to make sure that you are meeting internal and external requirements when you are in quality. And when you are entering industry, you're just going to be working on a small sliver. So you may be a quality analyst who's working in documentation control, and you're responsible for making sure that documents that are about to be approved are meeting all the relevant requirements. You may be somebody who's on an investigation team trying to investigate situations to get them to root cause. You may be somebody who's involved in the batch release process. If you're entry level, you're not going to be involved in doing final release of a product, but you may be doing some of the early quality reviews and things like that to help support the final release. Moving into regulatory affairs typically serve as the interface between a company and health authorities. Their typical responsibilities include submitting documentation to agencies. This may include things like INDs that are for investigational drugs or clinical studies. It may include NDAs for new drugs or PMAs for devices and things like that. They're the ones who are responsible for kind of the regulatory strategy and how are you going to be submitting all of the relevant information to health authorities. They're responsible for reviewing and interpreting global regulatory requirements. They're the ones who are responsible for managing product labeling and package inserts and handling sort of the negotiations that happen with regulators. They may get involved as a secondary supporting audits and inspections from a regulatory point of view, but quality is the one who typically owns most audits and inspections. They may get involved in doing reporting to agencies. This is particularly important if you're working in a local office where you're going to be responsible for taking an adverse event or some report and reporting it to the relevant health authority. They really handle all of the communications between your company and regulatory agencies like FDA or Health Canada or EMA. They may get involved in supporting life cycle management activities. So if you transfer from one site to the other, you may need a regulatory impact assessment to see, does moving from this one site to the other site impact our registration? They may get involved in updating specifications if that spec is part of a approved product recipe, let's say. So in a nutshell, regulatory affairs makes sure that you're meeting your regulatory requirements, that the product regulatory strategy complies with what external requirements are, and that they're the ones who are the main interface between you and a health authority. Moving into research and development. Now, research and development develops the product and generates data that supports your basis for saying that a product is safe, effective, or usable. They're responsible for designing and testing prototypes, or they're responsible for evaluating different drug formulations. They're the ones who are conducting feasibility studies, or they're working on how to optimize a product, or they're working on scaling up your product so that it's manufacturable. Typically, we'll be doing test method development. So whenever you're creating a new product, you have to figure out, how do I make sure that it's okay? And so R&D will figure out all of the different methods that you're going to use to test product to make sure that it's okay. They will also do things like generate preclinical data for regulatory submissions. They may write technical reports or protocols. On the device side, they're responsible for design controls, which is the product development life cycle that you need to follow: design inputs, outputs, verification, validation, and all of that. You can look into design controls if you're super interested in that on the device side. And they are responsible for collaborating with regulatory and quality in their development projects to make sure that the work that they're doing is meeting the appropriate requirements. But R&D is really the engine that's driving the development of a product. Moving into clinical affairs, the clinical team plans and executes your in-human studies to gather real-world data. Clinical affairs is responsible for designing clinical trial protocols, defining what your study endpoints are. They're responsible for making sure that informed consent documents are written in a way that meets requirements and that there's an IRB in place for reviewing protocols, and IRBs are ethics committees. And so that they're in place, they're responsible for managing clinical trial sites, timelines, data collection. They're responsible for working with contract research organizations or CROs, collaborating with them on the execution of a study. They're responsible for monitoring how a study is being executed and monitoring the study for compliance to the protocol. They're responsible for reviewing the data that's generated out of the study and helping generate the clinical study reports to support any kind of submission. And clinical is really the bridge between the lab data and the patient data. They're the ones who are looking at all of the stuff that's going into and coming out of clinical trials to help support what are the conclusions that are coming out of the clinical studies that you are conducting. The next role is manufacturing and operations. So manufacturing and operations are responsible for production. They're responsible for commercialization. That means that if you work in manufacturing operations, you're running equipment and producing batches according to validated processes. You're maintaining equipment and making sure that there's cleaning validation in place. You're completing batch records for the activities that you're doing. You're following all of the appropriate SOPs, control plans for your production process. On the manufacturing floor, if an issue comes up, you're escalating deviations based on your processes, and you're collaborating with QA or QC for in-process checks, release tests, and things like that. You support investigations and continuous improvement projects. If you work in operations, depending on the company that you're working in, that may include not only manufacturing, but also packaging, labeling, warehousing, and other logistics. The next one is QC and analytical testing. So QA and QC are two sides of the same coin. QC is typically separate because QC is responsible for testing materials, doing in-process testing, and doing like incoming inspections and doing final product release to make sure that and reviewing final product testing to ensure that they meet specifications. QA is a little bit more gray, you could say, and QC is a little bit more black and white, because in QC, you're performing routine analytical, chemical, micro testing. You're looking at raw materials that are coming in. You're documenting and you're reviewing test results per very specific GMP requirements. You need to highlight any out of specifications that come up or lab errors. You're maintaining lab notebooks, logbooks, and in most companies, there's electronic systems called LIMS that you work in, and you're collaborating with QA, R&D, regulatory operations as needed. QC is often, like I said, a separate group from QA, but they work closely together to ensure that there's appropriate product quality, data integrity, and that the product can be released. Final release is typically done by QA, but a bunch of the intermediate stuff that happens in contribution to the product release. Let's say, for the sake of example, you have an incoming, let's say you're working on a product that has a part that's being received by the manufacturing site. QC will do the incoming inspection and they'll say, we reviewed X number of pieces and they were okay. QC will do the in-process checks, and then QA will look at the incoming inspection and the in-process checks and all the manufacturing records and all the batch records all together and say, based on that entire body of evidence, we can release. That's at a high level, but you can always look into the differences between QA and QC because there's some nuance there. The next one is supply chain and procurement. This function, supply chain, makes sure that all the materials or components or even the services that you're using are on time and that they meet quality expectations. Your supply chain procurement sourcing team is responsible for sourcing your raw materials, your packaging, and your service. You may be responsible for a sterilization service, or you may be responsible for a component or a raw material. And so you work with QA, managing suppliers and ensuring that suppliers are qualified before use, checking that they're qualified on an ongoing basis. You're responsible for planning and forecasting inventory and making sure that you understand what your production needs are. You're making sure that all the appropriate contracts are in place. You're working with quality to make sure that a quality agreement in place. And in regulated industries, supply chain isn't just logistics. It's about making sure also that everything that you're working with is traceable and compliant. The last one that I wanted to highlight as a separate role is validation and technical services. So, depending on the size of the company that you work in, validation and technical services may be the same as manufacturing operations. But this is an area where a lot of people start their career in. I wanted to talk about it specifically because validation teams make sure that equipment, systems, and processes perform as intended and that they're set up appropriately. In a validation role, you're writing and executing protocols for equipment or for utilities or for processes, and you're doing the IQOQPQ, which is installation, operational, and performance qualifications to support manufacturing execution. You also support cleaning validation and sterilization studies. You will help with writing and executing protocols, documenting raw data, generating final reports. And this role particularly fits in with tech transfers and scale ups and commercialization. So if you have a product that's being designed, it needs to be transferred into production. And the validation role is really that in between R&D here and finished manufactured product. You make sure that the product can be made. You're basically turning an R&D concept into something that is a reproducible commercial process. As you can see, this industry is cross-functional. You may work in one role for the rest of your career, or you may touch on all 8 of them. Who knows? Once you get into industry, the world is your oyster and you can map out your career however you want. I've personally landed in quality. I really like it. I won't discount the possibility of ever moving out, but I just can't see myself not working in quality for the next 80-90% of my career. For you, it might be different. And I'll just end by saying that my first role in industry was in R&D, and I really sucked at it. I was like really bad at it. And that's because it was a role that was literally suited for all of my weaknesses. And when I started out in R&D and I moved into operations. And then when I worked in operations, I'm like, oh, hey, I'm actually pretty good at my job. And then I moved into quality and it was like hand to glove fit, perfect for what my natural strengths are. I'll end off by saying a lot of the roles, you won't know a whole lot of detail until you're in it. And what you can do is reflect on your strengths, your interests, learn the different languages of the different teams that are involved, put yourself out there so that you can ask really good questions when you're being interviewed, so that you have a level of understanding of what you're getting into. So if you're a structured person like I am, maybe R&D isn't for you. Maybe focus on regulatory or quality or operations as a primary. Or if the idea of having something that's routine or strict expectations to follow makes you anxious, then maybe consider working in R&D as an example. Or if the idea of working in clinical studies is something that you're really excited about and you like coordinating a bunch of people, then clinical may be for you, or sourcing. The importance of really reflecting on what your inherent strengths and what your weaknesses are really important for how successful you're going to be in industry. I'll end by saying that roles and titles vary, but you can see that the overall work that we do follows a pattern. Depending on what you think you will like, learning how to spot where each person contributes to the product will give you a huge edge as far as not wasting a lot of time trying to figure out what you're good at. You may think, I'm somebody who likes the structure, so I'm going to try regulatory and quality first. And so that is it on the different roles and maybe some thoughts as you are approaching your job search. So I hope you enjoyed this